Even if I tried, even if I wanted to, I can't change. Even if I tried, even if I wanted to. My love, she keeps me warm. She keeps me warm.
Hello, class, and welcome to Chapter 6, Sexual Orientation, which is also Lecture 6. As we can see, we had 3 different songs today. The first one was by Blur, Boys and Girls. The next one was by Lady Gaga, Born This Way. And the last one was by Macklemore, Same Love. All 3 of these songs are dealing with sexual orientation, sexual behaviors, and sexual attraction in some kind of capacity. Whether it's loving yourself, not being able to change yourself, and dealing with that acceptance process, or kind of like the first one where it's kind of just discussing how we're looking for people who have these different preferences and boys who like girls who do boys like girls and different things like that. Really some interesting lyrics to listen to and kind of getting us in the discussion of sexual orientation, which is this combination of sexual attraction, sexual behavior, as well as this moral and societal compass and pieces of it that we will get into a little bit more today. As we'll see, one of the first things that we like to try and cover in this class is we always like to try and cover definitions. One thing I like to say about this is just like when we talk about gender and gender identity, when we're starting to talk about people's identity, there's a lot of nuances in which we can define or utilize our identities to define ourselves. And so someone describing themselves as homosexual or a gay may not be the same as another person describing themselves as homosexual or gay. And we'll kind of get into these nuances, but when we're talking in these lectures, we're trying to talk in general capacity as possible to increase understanding, but I also want to be respectful of the fact there's a lot of nuances out there. There's a lot more gray area than there is black and white. And so though I may be talking in very general terms, I really want to try and respect that gray area as much as possible. So know if you feel like I may be marginalizing identity or marginalizing the way you identify specifically as one of the identities we cross over, please know that I'm trying to give general ideas and general perceptions, not necessarily all the nuances that can be out there, and that this is a very heavy gray area. When we talk about identity, what an identity means to me can be very different than the next person who shares all the same features as I do in every other category. So just always like to put that out there in those nuances that this is a very dicey gray area and trying to talk about. So we will be talking about it in general terms, but also know that's also we're trying to respect the nuances that we do see, the many shades of gray that exist in the world. That being said, one thing that we see within issues within research when it comes to sexual orientation is the fact that we don't all have the same definition. So in a general terms, and when we're talking in this course specifically, we're going to talk about sexual orientation as the unique pattern of sexual and romantic desire, behaviors, and identity each person expresses. And so it is the combination of not just the actual desires, but the attitudes, how we identify with those attitudes, the behaviors, how we identify with these, and our attitudes that are wrapped up in both of our desires and our behaviors, and how we really choose to identify that. As you guys will see in the book, and as you kind of see, there's different views or ideas of how to identify or to define sexual orientation. When we're talking about sexual orientation and identity, a lot of times when we speak about it in a psychological sense, we're really talking about the identity piece, so those psychological components. We're not necessarily always talking about the behaviors, so the act of fornicating or having sexual relations with a person of the same gender as you or same sex as you. And that can be a little dicey when we're talking about the research. A lot of times when we're talking about research, we'll ask how you identify versus the practices you've had. And so you may have had a same-sex sexual experience, but that doesn't necessarily dictate that you're gay. And so you will never maybe identify as gay, but you did have a same-sex sexual experience. And so those are one of those nuances, is just because it's happened doesn't mean that's what I am. That's not how I identify, but that doesn't mean the possibility of the act of occurring is not actually there. And so one way that we kind of think about this is a lot of times when we're thinking as humans, we really like to have a checkbox system. We really like to be able to say, you're this, you're this, you're not this, you're this, and we can move on. We can categorize people. Unfortunately, we live in a world of gray, and we live in a sea of nuances, is the way I always like to think of it. And so we can try and think of sexual orientation as this categorical, either homosexual, bisexual, heterosexual, or as we're kind of discovering and kind of figuring out, it's more of this continuum, or this continuum idea of there's this range of sexual identity, and many of us can fall at different points on those spectrums. So one of the first ones of those was the Kinsey scale, and we've talked about the Kinsey survey in earlier when we first started talking about sexology research. This is one of the biggest and most methodologically sound research projects to initiate sexology research. And he really developed the scale, and it's a 0 to 6 scale, so 7-point Likert scale, where on 0 we have exclusively heterosexual, and then on 7 or 6 we have exclusively homosexual. And when we talk about the Kinsey report numbers, when he said anyone who identified as homosexual or they're identifying homosexuals, they were actually talking about anyone who identified who scored a 5 or a 6 as homosexual. He was considering kind of this 2, 3, 4 area to be more bisexual and this to be more of the heterosexuality in realm. So when he did his research, he was finding out that there was about 10% of people identified as homosexual, and that's in that 5-6 range. Which we'll see kind of through this chapter and through later in this lecture that is not necessarily true and doesn't necessarily hold up to more rigorous scientific scrutiny. One reason why the Kinsey report has a little bit higher than average ranking of LGBT identifying individuals is because he actually sampled from prominently LGBT areas. So he actually was doing sampling of going to gay bars, which means you're going to have a higher incidence rates of people identifying as a sexual minority in a place in which sexual minorities feel accepted and are actually designed for them to be able to meet and congregate. This also allows for more variability and the possibility of change, which isn't something that we necessarily always talk about. But we do see that sexuality is not necessarily so consistent through people's lives and that there is some fluidity to it. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more as we go along as well. The thing is, though, is even with using this continuum, we still do not see every sexuality represented here. Really what we have here is we have sexuality defined on this gender spectrum as well, right? Homosexual, heterosexual, still using this gender. Whereas what happens when we have someone who identifies as pansexual, which is akin to being bisexual, except for lack of recognition of the gender binary. So you're not just attracted to men and women, you're attracted to people who may fall in that continuum of gender. So someone who may be androgynous, both embracing masculine and feminine characteristics. People who identify as transgender would also be open for your attraction, where some people would consider those who identify as bisexual not being as open to that non-gender binary or non-gender conforming types of identifying individuals. And again, this is one of those little nuances. I know many people who identify as bisexual who don't care about the gender of the other person. It's more of I'm attracted to men and women in the spectrum in between. And I know other people who they're bisexual and they are attracted to men and they're attracted to women, and when you throw in non-gender conforming, their attraction gets lost. And so they have specific aspects of masculinity, specific aspects of femininity that they're attracted to, which is generally embodied in someone who is cisgender as well. So they have a cisgender bisexual attraction where someone may have a transgender. They don't care as much about how much your gender matches your biological sex. They care about the combination and how it's developed and expressed by a person. So even when we do this continuum, we still don't necessarily have room for some other identities that are out there and that we do definitely see. One of them, kind of like I discussed, was this pansexuality, which is the attraction to all sexes and gender identities, meaning that if someone is transgender, that is not going to affect your attraction to them. You actually may embrace the fact that they have a little gender fluidity in their life, and that actually may increase your attraction to them is because they don't necessarily have these gender identities or roles that they're rigidly sticking to. Another one that we haven't talked about yet is asexuality, which is no interest in partnered sexual activity. One thing I always like to point out there is this is in a partnered sexual activity. This does not mean that people who are asexual do not masturbate or do not have sexual interests. It's more of they don't necessarily have the sexual interest in partnered activities. And so there's no sexual desire to be with someone else, but it doesn't mean that they don't experience sexual arousal in different aspects like that or participate in masturbation. Because it's not necessarily about sexual interest, it's about partnered sexual activity. There's no interest in the partnering and expressing sexuality in that kind of manner with someone else. So even that spectrum doesn't really give room for this pansexuality because homosexual, heterosexual are kind of really gender binary tied in a lot of different ways. And this asexuality, where on that scale do you fall? If you really have no interest in other people sexually at all, there's really not a spot for you to fall. So even though we see that it's still not encompassing enough. It's still not enough of a spectrum or considering enough aspects of what sexuality and sexual orientation have in it. And really, if you kind of think about it, when we define sexual orientation as your romantic desire, your behaviors, and your identity, this might explain people's identity, but it may not explain their actual behaviors or maybe their desires. And so maybe they do have the desire for same sex, but they identify as heterosexual because the behaviors they feel sanctioned or allowed to partake in. And so it's a lot more complicated when we get into these nuances of attitudes, identity, behaviors, and desires. So when we're looking at the prevalence of sexual orientation, sexual minorities. Again, what we see that Kinsey's estimates were actually probably artificially high due to non-random sampling. And again, as we kind of covered in the sexology research, random sampling is taking all possible participants, giving them all the equal chance to participate, and then trying to solicit that participation or select from them randomly a good sample or proportion of those to represent the whole. What we see within Kinsey's studies is that he actually did not do this. He went into areas that were predominantly or would be more likely to have LGB members, and such as gay bars, as I was saying earlier. He actually went into different gay bars to do his recruiting for some of his participants to be able to solicit those identities, which actually gave an artificially high or a false positive rate in which we're seeing LGB identifying individuals. What we've seen is most recent studies have produced highly variable rates depending upon how the question was asked. And again, this is getting down to that definition of, are we talking about identity? Are we talking about how you currently are practicing? Are we talking about ever having a desire at all and maybe not acting? So as we kind of look through this, what we'll see is we see the National Survey of Family Growth in 2002 shows that we had about 11.2% of females have sex with a same-sex partner, as opposed to 5.6% of men within the survey. And we had 1.3% of women and 2.3% of men identifying as homosexual. Bisexual, we had 1.8 and 2.8. And then something else, we have 3.9 and 3.8%, with the rest of them identifying as sexual or heterosexual. When we move to 2006-2008 survey, which is about 6 more years in the future, we see a little bit higher percentage of women who have ever had sex with a same-sex partner. Same here with men, we see 5.1%, so about the same percentage rate. And then kind of what we see here is we kind of see a little bit of a decrease overall with homosexuality, bisexuality, and identifying as something else for both men and women across this study. These studies, and the National Health and Nutrition Examination Study, they're kind of finding 7.1% for females, 6.8% for males who've ever had a same-sex sexual partner. And then the identities, again, are around that 2% mark for the homosexual, 1.3% for bisexual for men, or 5% for women, and then again, a little bit less than a 1% for identifying as something else. And then we have the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior, which again, we're kind of seeing these same rates of about 1% homosexual women, bisexual women about 4%, and about 2.5% as identifying as something else. And we're seeing for men about 4.2%, 2.6% identifying as bisexual, and then 1% identifying as something else. We'll get into this a little bit on maybe why there is some differences in these numbers for men and women and talking about sexual fluidity or erotic plasticity, which we've mentioned in other lectures. But this is kind of getting you a general idea, and we can see that the rates in which people identify having ever had a same-sex partner are a little bit closer to that of what Kinsey was getting, but when we look about identity, how people identify themselves, how they're willing to portray themselves to the world or define themselves to the world around them, we are seeing actually lower rates of lesbian, gay, and bisexually identifying individuals. And we even see that maybe with our continuum we have in the different ways we approach sexuality, if we have a total of 2.3% of women and 1% of men identifying as something else, means that we may not even be actually capturing the true spectrum or realm of sexuality for people to be able to report on this themselves more accurately. So even right there shows you that when we just have this category of something else, that's a big category of what identities are we identifying here and what are we missing from this overall picture. And so again, it kind of goes back to this question was asked. If we asked or we defined sexual orientation by the act of having sex with someone of the same sex, we'd have a lot higher numbers here, right? According to this study, we'd have 12.5% of women would be identifying as homosexual and 5.1% of men. Now that is not necessarily correct because you may have had an experience, but that does not dictate your actual identity. So if we identified it, or if we decided to define sexual orientation as not the experiences you've had, but the way you choose to identify or you foresee your experiences going in the future, that would be getting along these lines of this identity. Who do you plan on being with or seeing yourself with in the future? And kind of that idea. So again, how we ask the question can make vast differences on what kind of numbers we get from people and what kind of prevalence and incidence rates we can surmise from that. So kind of what we're going to get into now is we're going to get into the theories of sexual orientation. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of start with that early psychological theories of sexual orientation. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but Freud was the first one to really talk about human sexual development and the stages of sexual development and giving us kind of a guide or a path of understanding of how we develop sexual desires and sexual behaviors and attitudes and how we enact that in our lives. One thing that I really like about Freud's work is, though he does say that we typically end up going through this realm of heterosexuality and that we usually end this place and that is the normal, quote unquote, normal trajectory, it also leaves open this idea of what is contextually based or desired and kind of that influence of context that can be very, very ever present. But one thing that he really argued though is that we are polymorphously perverse, meaning that as humans, we can derive pleasure from almost anything, whether that be an object, whether that be an action, or a combination thereof. And so this isn't saying that as like with some species in which we're only going to have a sexual desire interest for one type of thing, we are readily able to develop a sexual desire interest in a wide variety of things. This is kind of the idea of where fetishes get involved, where people may have a rubber or a leather fetish, where they have to have that latex or that rubber involved in the sexual act, or maybe the smell of it, or some kind of aspect of it present to be able to have a fully sexually gratifying experience. Other people can do different things such as feet or body parts in which they really concentrate or focus on that really highlight or central their desires around. And that's this idea that we are polymorphously perverse. We can find attraction and desire in a wide range of things and we're not restricted. And what actually is, and what Freud argued, is that we learn this process, we learn how to diversify our perversities to specific realms based off of associations, based off of conditioning, based off of this training principle of learning what is accepted, what isn't, kind of that idea of like what is pleasurable, what isn't pleasurable, and slowly chipping away and narrowing this down until we have our sexual interests defined and our sexual behaviors more readily developed. So he argued that homosexuality stems from a fixation while passing through certain developmental stages. And so even though he does say we're polymorphously perverse and that allows us to be open to derive pleasure from almost anything, that there's still this biologically driven need or desire for reproduction, and homosexuality goes against that. And so even though we can be polymorphously perverse, he believed that homosexuality stemmed from a fixation at either one of two phases. So the first phase, which when I think about this, it kind of like automatically makes sense to me, but being stuck at the phallic stage. And though it is a very, very, very big oversimplification to say gay men like penises, when I think of that, I think of phallic stage. Of course, a gay man would get stuck there, and that would be the result of him being a homosexual. Now, that is definitely more of a ha-ha, he-he type of moment. Don't take that to words. But this was Freud's belief, and this is what he theorized, is that males who got stuck at the phallic stage of development or an unresolved Oedipal complex, due to the presence of, due to overpresence of the mother, kind of thinking of helicopter mom and absent dad. Basically saying that they're not able to overcome this complex because of the relationship they developed with their mother and father. They're not healthily able to resolve this, which gets them stuck desiring other men. And then again, the phallic stage, not being able to overcome that part of the stage and getting stuck at this sexually perverse or sexual, deriving sexual pleasure from the phallus or a phallic-like object such as the penis. So even though we are polymorphously perverse and he really believed that, he also believed that this homosexuality stemmed from getting stuck at one of these stages because it wasn't in line with our biological drive to reproduce and to have children. And so it really went against some of his ideas, but at the same time, he really did ultimately believe that we had this polymorphously perverse nature to us and that we could really develop a wide-ranging gamut of things we are attracted to or which gets us revving and going, what we desire and derive pleasure from. Since this time, we've had lots of other theories, psychological theories come to play, but we're going to cover a little bit more of those when we're talking about biopsychosocial models and when we're combining these different theories of sexual orientation. But really, Freud got us really started on psychosexual development of humans, and different theories and counseling theories have gone on since to add different bits and pieces, especially when it comes to the idea of like sex therapy and treatment for sexual difficulties. And even this, the theories around sexual orientation and the fact that we got stuck or fixated actually led to the development of different therapies trying to treat homosexuality, which we'll get into a little bit later on as we talk about the myths. So when we look at the biological and hormonal theories, we do see differences in brain structures between homosexuals and heterosexuals. So the differences that we see is we actually see it in the hypothalamic structure size based on sexuality. What we were seeing that homosexual men brain sizes were more akin to heterosexual women which is with this area being smaller. Smaller in nature. Whereas for heterosexual men, we're actually seeing the size of the structure of the brain being almost twice as large. But with homosexual men and heterosexual women, we're really seeing this equality coming out and this equal, when it comes to volume being measured, we kind of see an equal volume being measured by both homosexual men and heterosexual women as compared to heterosexual men. However, one thing that we always have to bring out is one confound of this was homosexuality was confounded with having AIDS. They did not actually, what they did was they did this on cadavers, which are dead people. There was no way to confirm or deny the sexual orientation. It had to be surmised from the medical history. And at this time, as what we'll kind of cover a little bit later on about myths, there was, especially in the early 90s, late 80s, AIDS was really considered a gay cancer. And so it was assumed that if you had HIV or AIDS, you were a gay man. And so it was kind of assumed that if you had AIDS, that you were gay. And so this may be a confound within the study that we weren't actually able to part and parcel out because the people were not alive at the time, so we're not able to actually confirm their identity. Sorry about that. We've also seen different research when it comes to fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. We can actually see the brain processing information while doing this, and so we're actually seeing changes in activation. So as much electrical energy is being produced by different neurons. That's what we pick up on these images. And what we see is in the amygdala, we see a lot higher activation. And we also see brain symmetry. And so what we see is that for homosexual men, we see a more balanced So again, we tended to see that gay men's brains looked more like heterosexual men or heterosexual women, but they also tend to be more symmetrical and possess a greater number of connections to the left side of the amygdala, where in heterosexual women and heterosexual men and lesbian women, we were seeing more activation on the right. So if we look at hetero men and lesbian women, we see the right amygdala. Being more activated, whereas in homosexual men, and heterosexual women, we see left amygdala activation. And so we really are seeing these differences in the brain and the way the brain is being activated based off of kind of these patterns of sexual identity and sexual attraction. And if you think about it, heterosexual men and lesbian women both attracted to female-bodied persons. And then same thing with homosexual men and heterosexual women are sexually attracted to male-bodied persons. And so seeing these similarities in some ways makes a lot of sense to us, but it's still something that we're still part and parceling out. And trying to determine, is it the growth after development? Is this a prenatal thing or a natal thing that we're seeing happen? Or is this due to experiences over time that change the shape of the brain and the brain's volume in different areas? One thing that we also see is that we see heterosexuals have more symmetry in their faces, so the actual facial symmetry is higher than in gay and lesbian identifying individuals. And this is actually thought to be one reason for gaydar. So for those of you who have maybe never heard of this term before, if you think of it, it's a combination of gay radar, or as some of my friends used to call it, it was guess the gay. And this is where people can say that they have a belief in which they can identify people's sexual orientation by looking at them. One thought or theory behind this is maybe it is this symmetry, this asymmetry that we're seeing is more likely to be gay or lesbian identifying individuals, but this is also on a very unconscious level. No one usually says, oh, that person's face isn't 100% symmetrical. I wonder if they're gay. They also believe that instead of it necessarily being the symmetrical part of the face, maybe this is combining with such as mannerisms, such as tone of voice, such as interactions that you're seeing play out between them and others around them. And that's what's coming together to create this complex of gaydar in which we are able to tell those sexual orientation based off of being able to look at them. Now, in reality, this gaydar does not necessarily fully exist, though people will argue with you that they have gaydar, they don't have gaydar, they're better at it. But we really don't have a theory on the development of or what is gaydar and if it truly exists or not. But it is this idea that we can guess people's orientations or have a more clear idea of these orientations based off of certain features of them, such as maybe tone of voice, mannerisms, and maybe the symmetry of their faces. One thing that we also see is that we see that gays and lesbians are more likely to be left-handed than their heterosexual counterparts. And we also have seen some research showing that gays and lesbians have 2 different finger length ratios. And so what we see is we'll see heterosexual men having a longer ring finger than index finger, where homosexual men are going to have a longer index finger than ring finger, where heterosexual women are generally a little bit more balanced. And what we see is we see the same patterns in homosexual women as we do in heterosexual men. So basically this is saying that the index finger is slightly shorter, the green is slightly shorter than the ring finger, and this is one of these ideas or maybe one of these characteristics that are developed based on these hormones, maybe based off of the hormones we are subjected to during prenatal development, and that may be creating these differences that we see in homosexual versus heterosexual men and women. Another tendency we tend to see is that the more older brothers a man has, the more likely he is to be gay. So one idea behind this, and one idea of this, which we've kind of talked about, is we've talked about the idea of the sensitivity to estrogen and testosterone while developing as a fetus, and that for some individuals, we can be more or less sensitive to this, as well as the process of developing, of going through gestation of a child can be very difficult on a woman and can change depending on the number of births you've given, right? So part of the idea behind this is that maybe the woman's body, the mom who is pregnant, is better at feminizing, so they are increasing the amount of estrogen or decreasing the amount of testosterone, or they're more resistant to the level of testosterone in their system after having a male child due to that experience. And so their body gets better at fighting or reducing those levels of testosterone. And so one idea is that this feminizes or adds more estrogen for that male baby to be exposed to and respond to, which may create this difference in what we're seeing. And some of the similarities, as we talked about before, when we're talking about the differences in brain structure, it might be this increase in estrogen or this increased responsiveness to estrogen while in the prenatal realm that could be partially responsible for these differences in brain structure, which then later lends to this idea of sexual identity and how we identify, develop our behaviors and attitudes. So that is something we tend to see more common, is that the more older brothers a person has, the more likely they're to be gay. We also see evidence from identical twin studies. They're more likely to share the same sexual orientation than that of fraternal twins. And we see this both within identical twins that are raised together in the same household, as well as identical twins that have been split through different adoption studies and different things like that that we've seen. And so we see that there is more likely to be a shared sexual orientation between identical twins than there are fraternal twins, than there is even between siblings raised in the same household together that are not twins or do not have that same level of genetic relatedness. Other things, kind of like we alluded to a minute ago, is that prenatal hormone exposure may explain many of these effects, right? However, none of these effects are 100% true all of the time, which means there's something else bigger at play, right? So our biology and our hormones, we don't have this perfect level of what creates a heterosexual versus homosexual, and that's how you're going to develop. It's really, this sets the stage for you to go and interact with the world, which will then later develop and change or modify your behaviors, attitudes, and feelings regarding sex, sexuality, and sexual orientation, which then lends itself to that identity management and how do we integrate that and how do we live that in our lives. Along with those biological and hormonal theories, we do have some evolutionary theories. One evolutionary theory is kind of like the gay uncle hypothesis, which is the idea that as a way, or another way to say this is kin selection hypothesis. And this is basically advanced as the idea that people who do not necessarily produce their own offspring generally will contribute to the raising of offspring in which they are related to. And so the idea, like there's a saying out there that it takes a village to raise a child. The idea is if your gay uncle or your family member who does not have children is not utilizing their resources on their own child, they'll devote some of those resources to you and your children, which will then help ensure that they survive and we replicate in this very complicated world of ours. One other idea is that homosexuality is actually a byproduct of female fertility. And so what we see is we see in families in which women are highly fertile or they really have a high chance of becoming pregnant, there's actually an increased incidence rate of homosexual men. And we only see this based off the maternal side. So no matter the paternal side and the fertility on the male side does not seem to determine as much of the sexual orientation as we see for female fertility on the mother or maternal side. So it's this idea that if you're coming from a family in which you have very fertile, highly fertile women, basically women who can reproduce very easily, maybe have a low incidence rate of miscarriage, or maybe biologically developed in a way that is more positive for child rearing, that this will actually increase the likelihood of their male children being gay because they need less of them to produce more offspring of a replacement. And so this idea of being able to replace the next generation, we don't need as many men, and so we can reduce heterosexuality in men due to this increased infertility. And then there's the alloparenting hypothesis, which is having a flexible sexuality may have been adaptive for helping women find mates if their children's father was not in the picture. And so this is the idea that we see erotic plasticity. And when we think of plasticity, that's the ability to be molded, changed, or transformed into something else. And so when we think of erotic plasticity, we're talking about the ability to change our erotic desires and the things that, attitudes and behaviors towards those. And so what we see is women generally have a wider range of erotic plasticity. They have more arousal to more different forms of stimuli than what we see in heterosexual men. And so one idea of this is that this flexibility, this allowing them to be able to change either their orientation or to be able to provide or get comfort in that bond from someone who will help ensure their life as well as the lives of their offspring, could be one reason why we see that women can have this more fluidity in their sexual orientation, and that they can identify from going from heterosexual to homosexual or back again. And this is a little bit more variable in women's lives than it is men's. And again, it's this idea that maybe there's this need to be flexible for your own protection and safety to ensure you can thrive along with your offspring as well. And again, none of these theories have necessarily proven themselves to be fully and all in themselves, but they all answer different pieces of a puzzle. But the puzzle we're trying to figure out is so complicated, and we're not even really sure where the borders are, that we're really just trying to find pieces and really trying to figure out where are our borders when it comes to sexuality and sexual identity, and how do we define this and work through this to identify as many of those gray pieces as possible, so we're not left in a muck trying to figure out which piece belongs where. And lastly, we got these kind of biopsychosocial theories, which are going to be the two biggest theories we kind of go over. So the first one of that is the exotic becomes erotic by Beam in '96. And so literally, as the title of this says, the idea behind this is, due to our temperaments, things that are exotic, different from us, that have that appeal, become erotic through this process of learning. And so this is the idea that he posed, that temperaments predispose us to gender conformity or gender nonconformity. And so this idea that it's our temperaments that actually dictate what things we enjoy playing with, such as boys' temperaments tend to lead them to be playing with more instrumental type things, such as cars and trucks like that, maybe blowing things up and more of those fighting aspects, where females are idea behind this is that their temperament is predisposed more to that connection or relational nature of play, and we tend to like those who we are more similar with. As we develop this idea of I'm more similar to them and I'm more different than this other person, that's what this exotic is, right? Exotic is something that's novel, unfamiliar to you, different than you, right? So this is kind of a difference. The idea is, as we differentiate ourselves from one another, or we relate ourselves that maybe like I am a boy and I enjoy playing with dolls and the relational nature, I start identifying more with the females I'm playing with because those are the same activities they enjoy playing. And so I notice the difference from myself, and those become this exotic, this intrigue on, whoa, what's that? It's different. I don't know what to do with that. And it's these feelings of difference that create arousal. And it's that anxiety or arousal that later becomes erotic in nature as we go through that puberty period and as we go through more of that sexual development. And so this arousal, this maybe anxiety that's caused of the differences between us, gets transformed into this erotic arousal, which then leads to that exotic becoming erotic. And it seems to explain male homosexuality better than female homosexuality, but it really doesn't explain all the bits and pieces of the puzzle. But it does seem to have this fit with male homosexuals and the development of male homosexuality. It doesn't seem to hold as much for female sexuality. And again, this could be that because the idea that women have this more flexible or fluid sexuality. And so maybe that it is not as, for men, it's less amenable to change. These experiences are more locked in or hardwired into us than females. So that could be one of those reasons why it holds for male homosexuals, but not necessarily female homosexuals or homosexuality. So when we're looking at the biopsychosocial theories, we're really going to be looking at the biological variables. So we are going to be considering the genetics, the exposure to prenatal hormones, the levels of that, definitely the androgen sensitivity of the mother. We're going to look at the childhood temperaments, so those kind of basic personality things that we're seeing, differences in activity level, aggression, other factors, kind of the attachment security, how that develops or how that's sought. We can look at the gender conforming and non-conforming behaviors, which is believed to be a part of that temperament, but engages with the world around us, and we're kind of conformed or non-conformed also based off our experiences. And so if you're punished for non-conforming behavior, even though your temperament is more for that, you may actually go for gender conforming behavior due to those experiences, and vice versa. You may go more gender non-conforming because you're rewarded for that than you would have normally if you weren't as rewarded for doing non-conforming behavior or gender behavior. Then we, through this and this conforming and non-conforming, we have the development of difference and the feelings of difference that go along with that. And this is this arousal that gets activated from noticing the differences between you and someone else. And through our development as humans, through the puberty and processes like that, this arousal starts going from kind of an anxious arousal to maybe erotic arousal. And we develop this interest or the sexual desire and interest in, well, this would be opposite or same-sex peers versus the opposite sex peers because of this feeling different from them. And then kind of here is that arousal. So we have generalized non-arousal in the presence of exotic peers, which then eventually comes in that erotic attraction. And again, like saying, around puberty, we have this arousal transform into a sexual arousal. Some of it may be a little bit more conscious. Some of it could just be biologically based, and you're having this arousal. You're having a human sexual arousal response to an anxiety, and it may not be that, but the pairing of that is what creates this association of sexual arousal to same-sex partners or opposite-sex partners. Though we talked about this in the idea of like developing same-sex attractions, the same thing could be developed in the idea of opposite-sex attractions. Usually we see young women and young men playing with each other and playing in groups gender-based, right, based on the activities. And so this difference between me being a boy and her being a girl will create that same type of arousal, which during the same physiological processes in puberty will turn into this sexual arousal towards the opposite sex. So even though this is very much slanted towards same-sex sexuality development, you could really switch it around and put a normal development for heterosexuality in there and change it around. Instead of it being different from peers, or it's feeling different from non-same gender peers versus feeling different from same gender peers. The next theory we're going to kind of talk about, and we've already alluded to a little bit, and we've talked about some, is the sexual fluidity. And when we talk about sexual fluidity, we're talking about the ability for sexuality to be changeable, to not necessarily be stuck in a more rigid or typecasted type of manner. And what we do see is men's sexuality as a little bit more hardwired. We don't see as much change that occurs, and we don't see as much flexibility within their sexuality, sexual arousal, and sexual responses. Whereas with women, it can be very category specific, but generally are a little bit more fluid in nature. And one thing that we talked about is that human sexual arousal lecture. we talked about how women shown on average to be more aroused to all sorts of stimuli, so heterosexual porn, homosexual women, and homosexual male porn, than men were on average, and men and lesbian women tended to be most aroused by for men, heterosexual porn, and for women, lesbian porn, which they were actually looking or viewing at the person that they identified as being sexually attracted to. Where heterosexual women had generally higher levels of activation across all three, and not as much differentiation between the two, where heterosexual men and homosexual women really had a distinct category in which they were becoming more aroused to. So again, kind of showing this little bit more hardwired nature, and as we kind of discussed before, lesbian women having similar brain structures to heterosexual men may explain why there's a little bit more hardwired, less fluidity that we see there as well. And we see that it appears to adopt their sexual and romantic attraction, women do, based off the specific person's interested in persons versus the overall categories. And so what we saw in a research project done over a 10-year period is that women were more likely to define their sexuality based off their current partner, more so than this general idea or overall category of what does it mean to be heterosexual or homosexual. And so we saw women in this study go from heterosexual to homosexual, going from unlabeled to lesbian, to all variations thereof, lesbian to heterosexual. And it was really based off of kind of that romantic and sexual attraction to the person they were with at the time versus this rigid idea of I belong in this category, or this is my identity. And so this kind of idea of the sexual fluidity, the biology creates predispositions, creates a range for us to enact in, and based off of our environmental factors, we're going to sway one way or another. We're going to dip a little bit deeper into different aspects of that, but we're all born with this range, or this capacity. And depending on our experiences, is which part of that capacity are we going to enact. And for some of us, that capacity gets really narrowed a lot quicker, whereas we see for women, there's a little bit more fluidity throughout it all, and it's not as hardwired as a straight-on path of what you're taking. And so we're really not clear why some women are fluid and others are not, but we are tending to see that maybe it comes to this evolutionary or this other biological need in which you may have to adapt more readily to the environment around you, and so having that sexual fluidity, that attraction and romantic and sexual attraction being more open may be a benefit for them, a survival mechanism in some senses. And going on to this is kind of related to that sexuality fluidity. We also see erotic plasticity. And this is that sexual behavior is more responsive to cultural and situational pressures. We also see that heterosexual women tend to show bisexual patterns of attraction. And so even though they might self-identify as being heterosexual, we see these levels of attraction or this arousal towards men and women more on an equal basis than what we would see in heterosexual men. And this suggests that sexual orientation might be organized differently in men's and women's brains and the way we perceive and go around the world. And it could also just be that socialization. In our society, in our culture, we've really had women not be allowed to be sexually active, own a sexual orientation. And so it could be this idea in which we have so much cultural and societal pressures that really that's what's forcing women's hand, in a sense, of their expression. And that once we change the idea around sex, the comfort around sex, the idea of being able to talk about sex, that maybe this cultural and situational pressures will decrease and we'll be able to see more of the natural development. Or it could be women are a little bit more in tune with the world around them, and this has a greater effect on their sexual orientation and sexual practices. Again, maybe going back to this idea of men being more hardwired and women's more category specific or based off the situation and relational nature. And again, organizing differently in men and women's brains, if we look at the hippocampus and the differences in the hippocampus and even just activation of the amygdala, we can see that there may be some basis on why we have differences in these brain shapes that may be responsible for how we respond to the pressures around us. The last part of this lecture is actually going to be talking about sexual attitudes, so we're going to talk about sexual prejudice, as well as we're going to be talking about myths around sexual orientation. And so sexual prejudice is prejudice that stems from one's actual or perceived sexuality. And one thing that I like to always put out there is perceived sexuality. It doesn't have to be based off of someone's actual sexual orientation or their sexual identity. It could be off that perception as well. And so I know growing up that I had a few men in my life who had very effeminate voices, who were always perceived as being a sexual minority when they identify as heterosexual. They've only had heterosexual relationships, as far as I know. But that's the way they identify, and so they've received the sexual prejudice based off that perception of the orientation, not even their actual orientation. And so when we look at the realm of sexual prejudice, what we see is we see homophobia, which is the negative attitudes towards gays and lesbians. And some people really have an issue with this idea of calling it a phobia, because phobia indicates a fear. Fear of, right? That's what a phobia is. Well, when we look at homophobia, fear is not the only response that we get or that we see expressed. And so some people really don't like this idea of homophobia because it's not a fear of, it's a negative attitude towards, a disliking, a discomfort. It's not necessarily a fear. Fear may be one of those reactions, but a lot of times it's not the only reaction in which we think of a normal phobia. We have heterosexism, which is the assumption that everyone is heterosexual. And the way you think about this is if you see someone wearing a wedding ring on their left hand, what's your first assumption about who their partner is? Do you assume that it's an opposite sex partner or a same-sex partner? That is a simple way to view how do we view heterosexism. It's this idea of what is normal, what is the typical, what do we expect from the average person. The idea that you would expect someone to have a partner who is opposite sex means you kind of have this heterosexism view of the world in which heterosexual is the normative, that's the average, it's what's going to be seen more often. It's not very often that we walk up to someone and we think, oh, I have no clue who their partner would be, because we do kind of have this norm in our society that heterosexuality is going to be present. Another type of phobia we see is biphobia, which is specifically negative attitudes towards bisexuals. And just like we see with homophobia, biphobia, again, is really, phobia is not the best part of the word for that, is it's not just a fear of, it could be anger, it could be resentment, there's a lot of other emotions that can be brought up with this, it's not just fear. And one thing I always like to point out is that, sadly, the LG population has a really high rate of biphobia. We also have a really high rate of transphobia. Right? So even within our own community in which we're supposed to be embracing other sexual minorities and other gender minorities, we really see this play out of biphobia and transphobia. There's common different things that are said within the LGBT community, such as bisexuals are fun to date but not to marry. And the idea behind that is that if you're going to be dating a bisexual, someone who identifies as bisexual and they have the same sex as you, that you're going to have really great sex with them, but when it comes to the romantic long-term relationship, they're going to default to the easier one, which is heterosexuality. Some ideas that are thrown out there is that they're just playing both sides of the fence, they're greedy, they can't make up their mind. Some people have a disbelief that bisexuality is actually a real identity, and they struggle with the fact that you can identify or be attracted to both sexes at the same time. And so what we see within the heterosexual community towards the LGBT community, we see within its own community towards itself, and really doesn't necessarily help us unify and understand each other when we have these phobias we're using against one another. And the last one that we're going to talk about on this slide is going to be monosexism, which is the belief that exclusive attraction to one sex is the norm. And so this is the idea that if you meet someone and they're in a relationship, that you assume that based off that relationship, that's how they identify, or that's their sexual identity. And so actually I have a couple friends who I've done this wrong, actually more recently too. One of them is a female and she is engaged, and she is actually doesn't necessarily identify as heterosexual, she identifies as bisexual, but my assumption was that she is engaged to a man, and so I assumed she was heterosexual. And so again, that attraction to one sex is the norm. I made the assumption that being attracted to one sex is the norm, and not only is it being attracted to one sex, but being attracted to the opposite sex. And this is before I knew her partner's name and confirmed that it was a man. She's a woman, so it is a heterosexual pairing. I have another friend of mine who I made the erroneous assumption the other day of that he was a gay man, and that was based off the fact that his partner and who he's engaged to is another man. And so that was, again, my idea, or me getting stuck in this idea that you were only attracted to one sex, and I really didn't leave open the possibility that he may be bisexual, that he's marrying a man, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have sexual attraction to women too. He just has this romantic partner he's choosing for life that happens to be the same sex that he is. And so this is even being a member of the LGBT community, being in this realm in which I can sit with sexuality, I can sit with gender, and I can talk about this. It doesn't make me uncomfortable to have some of these uncomfortable conversations. I get caught up in these realms because of the way I live my life, the associations I've had. And so it's hard, even for someone who is open to this type of multicultural diversity, to get caught up in these. And the biggest thing is to be willing to say, crap, I did that, I'm going to own it, and I'm going to watch it walking forward, and how can I change this differently? We do see that sexual prejudice is common, but attitudes vary cross-culturally. And we see actually that biphobia may be even more prevalent than homophobia. And part of this is that the biphobia is partially experienced within the sexual minority community as well as outside of it. And so you have the heterosexual normative biphobia, but then also within the LG community, we see this biphobia starting to transcend and be present, which really isolates this community even further and doesn't really help them enact their rights or or overcome the stigma or discrimination or this prejudice that we're all experiencing. We also see that this may stem from religion, a lack of intergroup contact or a negative intergroup contact, and then we also see a fear of one's own homosexuality. And so we do see that those who have higher religiosity generally tend to have higher levels of homophobia. Which, if we look at religions as a whole, a lot of religions really have a central tenet that sexual relations is about procreation, which is that heterosexual normative. And so it would make sense that having this heterosexual normative be part of these religious practices, stories, and narratives, that it would really be something that would increase the likelihood of homophobia experienced or seen. Kind of this fear of one's own homosexuality. If you guys remember back to the sexual arousal lecture, I talked about a penile stentograph in which we measured latent homosexuality. So we had men in different groups watch 3 different types of porn: homosexual women, heterosexual, and then homosexual men. And we saw those who had the highest ratings of homophobia, so endorsed the most homophobic beliefs and thoughts, actually had the most arousal to the homosexual male porn. And it's this idea that this fear of their own sexuality, this fear of their own identity as being a homosexual, causes them to have such a outward reaction that they treat those who may threaten their own identity, their own sexual identity, by identifying that way in a negative way, as a way to distance themselves from their own homosexuality. The idea is, if I can accept you and your homosexuality, that means I have to accept me and mine. Whereas if I don't accept you and yours, I don't have to accept me and mine. And so this idea of creating distance from your own identity, your own feelings, by creating distance between you and others as well. And then consequences of sexual prejudice include physical violence, which we have seen in the form of hate crimes, discrimination and discriminatory practices, and chronic stress. And so even though we see that gay marriage is legal in the United States, we still see that discrimination is still legal in like 30 states out of the 50 when it comes to maybe housing discrimination or doctor discrimination. Actually, I've been seeing these commercials online lately in which we see, or not online, on TV lately, in which I am seeing this lesbian couple trying to get their 2-year-old daughter into a pediatric doctor. the pediatric specialist decided that they will not see them as a client because their parents are homosexual. So they're denying this medical care, this medical coverage, and this privilege a lot of people receive in our country due to the sexual orientation of their parents, which is a discriminatory practice. Because your parents are lesbians, I'm not going to treat you and give you the same access to my services. And we also see chronic stress. And so this idea of being in a stigmatized community, experiencing stigma and discrimination requires a resilience to get through. And so you have to deal with this chronic stress. And as we see with chronic stress in a lot of other health psych classes or psych classes in general, the higher level of stress, generally the worse off your mental health and as well as physical health will be in the long run. And so nowadays we actually have hate crimes. When one thing I always kind of like to bring up when we talk about sexual orientation is even when I was growing up, hate crimes really weren't really talked about. One of the first hate crimes or one of the first instances in which we saw this kind of phrase being thrown about was with Matthew Shepard. Which Matthew Shepard was a gay man who went to the University of Wyoming who, after going to a bar one night, ended up leaving with two gentlemen who basically beat him up and left him for dead tied up to a post on a farm. He ended up being seen by a young individual who was riding his bike. Paramedics came. They were able to take him to the hospital. He unfortunately died as a result of his injuries. But this happened in 1998. And this was one of those major first instances in which someone was hurt, murdered, or killed due to their sexual orientation, and that was kind of a main reason for being understood in that case. It's still argued on exactly what happened, but the idea behind it is because of Matthew Shepard's homosexuality, it ended up leading to circumstances that led to his death because of his interaction with these two gentlemen. So this is one of those first instances of seeing a hate crime, but really before this, other than physical assault charges, there wasn't any extra consequences for trying to go after someone based off of an identity they have, just purely to try and damage or cause fear to those who identify that way. And this is one of those first instances in which we see that. My experience with this growing up as a gay man, knowing at this time that I was a gay man, this is really hard for me to realize that I may be killed, that people are out there in this world who may kill me because of my sexual orientation and my identity. And really, when this happened, I grew up about 30 minutes away from this. So I grew up 30 minutes away from the hospital that he died in. And so this was when I was around 10 years old, and so I was developing an understanding of my likes and interests, and it really hit me hard to have this idea of, if I am who I am and I like who I like, someone may take my life away. And so this is one of those things of that chronic stress, this worry that the average heteronormative person doesn't necessarily have to worry about. Because I'm heterosexual, someone may not like me and want to take my life, like this experience directly did for a lot of people in our community. So I always like to put that out there. Hate crimes, we hear about it a lot now, but like in 1998, it wasn't really a big thing and it wasn't really something done. And it's been more of a recent development that we've seen this idea of a hate crime and trying to punish people for trying to inspire hate or fear in different communities. Unfortunately, psychology, love my field, but we did not help the community out at all. Until 1974, homosexuality was listed as a disorder in the DSM. So if you identified as a homosexual or you partook in homosexual activities, same-sex sexual relationships, you would have been diagnosed and thus treated for homosexuality. Really, it was in 1957 that we started doing research that demonstrated gay men are just as well adjusted as heterosexual men, as well as the Kinsey report. Showing the existence. The broad existence of same-sex relationships or same-sex sexual experiences kind of really started changing the tide on what we thought about homosexuality and whether it was a disorder or not. And at the same time that we did this, we actually started getting rid of conversion or reparative therapy for more gay affirmative therapy, which is literally affirming someone's sexual orientation and helping them prepare to cope for the stigma they may experience by identifying in that way. And so it's giving them the resources and tools to recognize stigma, recognize the effects of stigma, how to cope with that, as well as the support and validation of who they are as a person, regardless of what messages they may have been given by society. And so we actually do promote and aim for gay affirmative therapy, and we've stopped conversion or reparative. And really, in recent years, there's been another push to get rid of these, but really, these are considered harmful therapies. Within the psychotherapy literature, they've actually seen that they cause more psychological damage and distress than they actually do cause relief in most individuals. And so it's actually suggested not to do any of these because you're actually going to cause your client or that person more distress and more pain than them just living life normally without having experienced that therapy. And if you're going to offer a therapy, it's this gay affirmative, affirming their identity, validating their identity and them as a person, not conversion or reparative, which is really invalidating how they identify and how they feel to adopt for a normative stance. This last little section that we're going to cover is going to be a little bit about the myths of sexuality and sexual orientation. So the first one is male bisexuality doesn't exist. And this is the idea that bisexual men, that they're just playing both fields. They're just being greedy. They're just trying to get everything they can, but they'll make a choice eventually, right? Well, what we have seen is we have actually seen that bisexual men show strong genital arousal to both male and female erotic stimuli. Unlike what we saw before, where heterosexual men will mainly do it towards heterosexual stimuli, bisexual men, we see this fluidity, this increased erotic stimuli to both male and female-bodied persons, or male or female-oriented erotic stimuli, which we don't necessarily see in men in general. And so it does show this distinct difference or distinct arousal pattern that we can see in some men, which provides evidence for bisexuality existing. There is this myth that gay partners must designate a husband and a wife. And this, again, is that heteronormative idea. I do it this way. You do too. Well, and what we actually see within a lot of gay and lesbian relationships or same-sex partnerships is we actually see a more equal responsibility in the housework. And part of this idea is that there has to be a negotiation. And the reason there has to be a negotiation is there's no real role models. If you think about it, you think about almost every TV show that's out there, almost every story that we hear about, things that we're exposed to. We're exposed to a model of a husband and a wife, partnership, male and female working a life together. We really don't see a lot of gay partnerships, which give us this preconceived idea or notion of what are my roles and responsibilities, what are their roles and responsibilities. So actually what we've seen is we've seen within same-sex coupling or gay partnerships, we've actually seen a higher rate of negotiation and more equal responsibility or division of those roles because society hasn't said that if you're a gay man who's this, you do these things, and if you're a gay man who's this, you do these things. We have these ideas of what do you do as a man, what do you do as a woman, or what do you do as a husband and a wife, not as husband and husband. Another one is that homosexuality is correlated with pedophilia. There is actually no evidence of this, and this is something that has been around for a very, very, very long time. And actually what we see is we see 95% of pedophiles self-identify as heterosexual. They are white and in their 30s. Oh, I messed up. So actually what we see for those who commit crimes involving pedophilia, we see that 95% of them self-identify as heterosexual males. They are white and in their 30s. And so there's actually no evidence linking homosexuality to pedophilia, but there is evidence linking identifying as a white heterosexual male and being in your 30s as being more likely to be a pedophile than any gay man is. And that's kind of the evidence that's really out there, is those, that homosexuality is not connected to pedophilia, but those who partake in pedophilia acts are more likely to self-identify as heterosexual, Caucasian, and be in their mid-30s. And as we can kind of see, you kind of have a fork and a knife. So which one of you is the fork? Trying to figure out how these chopsticks work their life when the chopsticks are looking at each other and say, we're chopsticks. Neither of us are a fork. We don't worry about which one's the fork and a knife because we're chopsticks. Some other myths is that gay parents raise gay children. There is no evidence that homosexuality is a learned behavior. And if this was true, if it really was a learned behavior, I'm not sure any of my friends would be gay because all of my friends have heterosexual parents. And so this idea that you're raised by a gay to be a gay is not true. And we also don't see you can't catch it. You're not going to catch the gay from being around other gays. One other myth that we see is that gay men are more promiscuous. And we do see that gay and heterosexual men have equally high sex drives and that their median number of partners is quite similar. And so gay men are not necessarily more promiscuous than heterosexual men. It may be more that we just see on average that men are more promiscuous than women, but there is no gender differences when it comes to sexuality or identifying sexuality, at least when it comes to heterosexual men and homosexual men. And this says, whenever people act like gay images in the media will influence kids to be gay, I want to remind them that gay children grew up with only straight people on television. And so this is kind of going to that idea of, I did not grow up until really Will and Grace came on, in which I saw another gay man that I could identify on TV. But we all grew up with heterosexuals. We all grew up with those ideas of like Leave It to Beaver family, and the Brady Bunch, and the Partridge Family. Not really any same-sex couplings, or even individuals who identified as being a sexual minority, at least readily known within these TV shows. Another myth is that bisexual people cannot be faithful. And in 2008 by Diamond, we saw that most bisexual women in their study ended up in long-term monogamous relationships. And this is kind of the idea that goes around the myth that bisexuals are people who are trying to play both fields. They're greedy, they're trying to get it all. It's the idea that they'll never be faithful in a real relationship, so they're fun for now, but they're not to keep for later. And I've heard this a lot, in which gay men will date bisexual men for a good sexual adventure, but they have a fear of being left for the heteronormative lifestyle, which is easier, and so they won't readily engage in these relationships, but they'll engage in romantic relationships, but they'll engage in a sexual relationship with an individual. And then what we also see is that most people who have HIV are gay or bisexual men, and I will say in the United States and in Australia, we do see a higher incidence and prevalence rates of HIV within communities where we have men sleeping with men. But worldwide, if we look at the worldwide and we take a step back just from our experiences here, we actually see the massive majority of infections are amongst heterosexual individuals, and that almost half of all infections are attributable to women. And so this really busts the idea that it's a gay disease, it's the gay cancer, when in reality it's a sexual disease, and we tend to see it in heterosexuals more than we see it in homosexuals. It's just our homegrown experience. It tends to be emphasized or talked about more within homosexual communities than we do see it in heterosexual communities. And I really hope you guys got some good information out of this lecture. I know it's really a complex lecture to be talking about all these different identities and where they fall in these spectrums, but really hoping that this gives you guys kind of a more firmer grasp on how we self-identify and how we do how sexual identities and sexual minorities may identify or work, and honestly the complexity of it all. The fact that there is a lot of gray area, there is not a lot of black and white, and we're trying to deal with these nuances while trying to respect what does it mean to be human. So thank you guys again. I hope to see you guys all next week and hope you guys are having a great time.